The Irish government has confirmed the expulsion of 4 of Ireland's 6 diplomats serving at its embassy in Addis Ababa. Ethiopia has ordered the diplomats to leave the country by next week. Ireland's ambassador and 1 other diplomat have been told they could stay. Ireland's Foreign Minister Simon Coveney has defended his country's stance on the ongoing conflict between the government and the Tigrayan forces. He argues that it is in line with that of other bodies, including the European Union. Ireland is a signatory to the November 5 United Nations Security Council statement that called for a ceasefire over the escalation of fighting in the north of the country. The Irish government says that it's echoed calls from the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, about the need for full humanitarian access, an end to fighting and political dialogue. The Irish embassy in Addis Ababa has not been closed, and that the 2 remaining diplomats will continue to work with bodies, including the African Union. Fighting in Ethiopia's northern Tigray region has been raging between federal forces and those aligned with them since November 2020. Well, to talk a little bit more about this, we're now joined by Abdullahi Boru Halakhe, who's an expert on governance, security and peace in East Africa. Thank you for joining us, Abdullahi. Always good to talk to you. We've had a number of conversations about Ethiopia, Tigray, and nobody really thought that it would last more than a year. And yet here we are. Abiy Ahmed himself went in there right at the beginning and thought he would put down this inconvenience, probably is what he thought, quite quickly. It has just escalated. Why?
I think, Peter, the reality of the war is everybody, when they start the war, they think that they know how they will end it. But war generally, whenever it starts, it takes its own life. And I think for a second, particularly the Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, never thought that this is what will happen. He thought this is, as he mentioned at that time, which is slightly over a year ago, this is going to be a law enforcement operation. It's going to be quick, and he will be able to leave. All right. So here, once over a year later, we're here having a discussion. On one hand, you have a desperate government that is trying to use every available opportunity to cast itself as a victim. On the other hand, you have a group of people who look at this as an existential crisis. So when you have a desperation, an anxiety over if you can even leave, that is a very, very potent mix that we are looking at. However, as I always say whenever I come on this particular program, there is always a window, but we shouldn't take it for granted. Like I said before, it's closing very fast. If it's not taken, the problem will not just stay inside Ethiopia or northern Ethiopia. It will extend to the rest of the Horn of African and East African countries. And for that reason alone, and the suffering of many women and children, this has to stop.
We're seeing the Prime Minister leave his office in Addis Ababa, leave his deputy in charge to go and fight on the front line. We see the Prime Minister urging citizens to defend their country, and we start to see Olympic stars, and symbolically that's quite a big message of them going to fight on the front line. It seems as if they've had a number of opportunities, they've continued to miss them. This kind of movement is not going to, I guess, easily endear the Tigrayans to come and sit at the table.
Between me and you, Peter, Prime Minister, much as he served in the intelligence of the Ethiopian People's Defense Forces, he is not a frontline soldier or a military officer. Gabriel Haile Selassie is a beloved long-distance track runner. His record in that regard is unembellished. He is known for, as a Kenyan, he caused Kenyans in so many Olympics a lot of problems. So when you see people who are not fit to serve in the military or do not have the necessary norms to go and fight in the military, going to the front line, you've got to pause and ask yourself, are these guys really taking this to be an exercise that you go show your face and come back? War is brutal. Anybody who served in war will tell you war is cruel. So the idea that people have got no knowledge about war, people have got no knowledge about fighting, are going to the front line because this is somewhat a video game or this is about public relations. War doesn't respond to public relations. War responds to brutal force. And so the idea that they go, for me, it sends two things. One, maybe they are so desperate. They've tried everything to throw out this conflict, particularly against the Tigray Defense Forces. And now they are so desperate, they are using every available means. That means throwing this, the kitchen sink at it. But that is desperation and it doesn't end very well. The second thing is, I think they reckon if these people start moving into the front line, and these are high-profile Ethiopians, maybe the people will be roused and be able to go to war. But once this war ends, whichever way it ends, Peter, what are we going to talk about? Gabriel wasn't loved by just, his ethnic community. Gabriel was loved by all the Ethiopians and anybody outside Ethiopia for his prowess. What would he say to a young Tigray child that he went to the front line? But maybe that young Tigray child looked up to Gabriel. Maybe he wanted to be like him. And now he's saying to him, no, I'm going to the front line to fight against your people. And so for me, that is the danger that we are creating every time we fail to take an opportunity to, pull back, because in war, nobody wins. We all end up being losers.
Addis Ababa is saying that they're defending the sovereignty of Ethiopia. What is the cause that the Tigrayans are fighting for?
Peter, sovereignty is always the last resort of anybody who do not want to listen. Every time, a country or somebody from outside says to you, do X and Y and Z, you say, no, I am the vanguard against the sovereignty, the territorial integrity. We are not going to be dictated two times, correct? But this is, the question of how Ethiopia will be governed is a question that has got a very rich history. Since 1930s, people have been asking themselves, how can we govern this country? Over 80 ethnic groups. And people are saying, let's centralize for a great deal of this country, whether it's during the Dark regime, during the imperial period. Ethiopia has always been ruled centrally from Addis, moving elsewhere. And for all their faults, there are many, there are legions. There are TPLF, and particularly when it ruled from 1991 until 2008, committed so many egregious mistakes. Human rights violation, detention without trial, all that is for everybody to see. But one thing that you've got to give them credit, maybe they made a virtue out of a necessity, is to have a multi-ethnic federal form of government, where at that time they had 9 regions, and in all these regions, people can, manage their affairs, their governance at the local level. But, foreign affairs, defense, and other issues are done and managed from Addis Ababa. Prior to that, some communities and some languages could not be uttered. Like, for instance, the Oromo people, who constitute 30% of the entire population, they were not allowed to use their language. And so for Abiy, he wants to harken back to the old imperial days of everything being controlled from the center. The genie is out of the bottle. There is no way he's going to return it there. And so for me, 2 things have to be done here and now, and they are very critical. Number 1 is halting of all fighting. Let's have a ceasefire for a second. Number 2, mutual recognition. Tigray should recognize that the current Ethiopian government that is led by Abiy is the legitimate government. And at the same time, mutually, Addis will have to recognize that the current TPLF government in the Tigray region, governing Mekele, is the legitimate government of that country. And the third, and which is very important, is to allow the humanitarians to be able to get into some of these places, not just the Tigray region, even in Afar region, in Amara region, where people are in desperate need of food, water, and medicine. They should be allowed in. And then we can begin the process of political negotiation of what form of government. It could be an interim government. We should probably have a national dialogue to ask Ethiopians what form of government that they would want.
Why are the Tigrayans marching to Addis Ababa if it is true? Because if there's one thing that's really difficult to get out of Ethiopia at the moment is information. There's so much propaganda on both sides. It's sometimes quite difficult to assess exactly where we are. But we do know that the Tigrayan forces have left their traditional stronghold and have moved south to other areas. And there's this threat on Addis Ababa. Why would they be leaving Tigray?
For them, they say as long as, and it not necessarily not need to be wrong, but they're saying as long as Abiy Ahmed is in power, he's shown us what he's capable to do to us. He's worked with, foreign country Eritrea to come and kill our people. The records are out there from human rights organizations, aid agencies, the violations that took place in the Tigray region. So to that extent, they're saying the only way for us to be able to be a viable entity within the polity that is Ethiopia is when Abiy is not in power. However, that cannot be the only way to resolve this. Correct. So I think you can understand why a group feel that this is an existential threat for us. The only way we can do is to get rid of the government of the day. You can understand that, but it need not to be the only way for Ethiopia to exist as a country, as we know. And I think that is where I mentioned mutual recognition of each other. The spark for this violence was Abiy dissolving the coalition that TPLF led into one single party that he called the Prosperity Party. And they said, no, we are not going to dissolve TPLF. In retrospect now, it looked like it was prescient that they knew what the problem would be. If they didn't have their party, that would have led to severe problems for them. So I think there is still a window. There are various efforts, some led by Kenyan government and some led by AU. All of them will coalesce into the AU led by the special envoy for the Horn of Africa, the former president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo. I think that is the only way. There is no viable alternative. Even if they knock off Abiy, there will be a huge percentage of the population that might not want to go back to a government that is led by the TPLF. So therefore, I think the only viable option here is to sit down and be able to have a political settlement of some sorts, and that can be determined by Ethiopians themselves or through other means. But at the moment, the current status quo will not hold. Abiy and his people cannot, at the current state, because I think close to a half of Ethiopia's military has completely been decimated. The few that are left are poorly equipped, and the morale is down. So TDF could come in, but then what country would they lead? As well, Abiy, he should be told in no uncertain terms that he is not going to subdue completely, at least militarily, the Tigray region. So it is a stalemate, as a brutal one as such. And I think the only way is a negotiated settlement out of this.
All right. So there is hope for those that are willing to sit at the table and deal with this. Abdullahi, we're going to have to leave that there, but I suspect we need to have another conversation quite soon as this situation continues to unfold. Thanks for your time today.
Pleasure, Peter, as always.